So
Yeah,
what
go.
we're going to talk about today is
Yeah.
is mercy,
Yep.
divine mercy, and but also in relationship to God's justice. It's actually an interesting topic that comes up a lot, for me as a moral theologian, when I'm teaching and stuff like that. And I think it's something that we can all struggle with. But because we'll have just celebrated the Feast of Divine Mercy, and we're kind of in that octave. I suppose it's not really
Yeah.
an octave, but we're in the Easter season, and of course, Divine Mercy is a prevailing theme in this season of the year for us. But I think it's important to understand, first of all, like what is mercy,
Yeah.
because there can be sort of false understandings of mercy. But then also, what do we mean by divine justice? And there can be false understandings of justice as well. And then how do they relate to each other? Like, how do we worship a God, or how do we know how to act or behave in relationship to sin? When we're trying to wrestle with the balance or the relationship between justice and mercy, and how does that play out? It's very complicated.
It's super complicated, and it's something, admittedly, that I struggle with all the time, because of all the things you just said. I have a notion of what justice is, first of all, and I think a lot of times my notion of what justice is really conditioned by, specifically the culture or the society that is most around, like surrounding me.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes I think, yeah, that there is something right about things that are right about the notion of justice that, like, you know America has, but I think there are things that are probably very wrong, or in, like, off the mark about that too. And then the mercy thing is something that I feel like has a lot of it has a lot of complexity to it, because it is this constantly trying to find the balance between, like, practicing mercy or showing someone mercy, but not, how do I want to say it, like, um, condoning maybe certain things that you know in your heart might be sinful or wrong, or, you know what I'm saying? It's like, how do I live that balance? How do I walk that line? It seems like a difficult line to me.
Well, it is. But I also think part of the reason why it's difficult is because we operate with some slightly distorted understandings of these principles,
Yeah.
or even just maybe outright flawed ones. And
Are
because
you
of
saying
that,
that's mine? Is mine
no,
the
no.
latter?
But I'm just saying that in general, like in our cultural environment, we don't always understand what we're talking about, and so negotiating real life situations becomes hard. It's like, what am I supposed to do here in this
Yeah.
situation? And the reality is that there is a way in which both of these things can kind of reside in our hearts, and our actions can express both things simultaneously. Whereas we tend to juxtapose them to each other. It's like, you either are going to be merciful or you're going to be just. But I think let's try to get a handle on
Yeah.
what we're talking about. First of all, let's start with justice. Um, and I think that first thing I would say is that people tend to think of justice first and foremost as a state of affairs out there in the world, like a
Okay.
certain balance of things,
Yep.
right? And I think in the most accurate understanding of the term justice, justice always has to do with relationships first and foremost. The things are in a right relationship with each other. And when we say right relationship with each other, there's a fundamental distinction between what belongs to me and what belongs to the other. So you can't talk about justice without distinguishing between what's mine and what's yours. Okay? And then we have to enter into a proper relationship with each other so that I give to you what rightfully belongs to you, and you give to me what rightfully belongs to me. And when we do that, our relationship is just. Now, we of course then have to drill down and say, well, what does belong to me and what does belong to you?
Yeah.
And that gets us into the realm of all of the different particulars in terms of, the substances of what we're talking about. Like, are we talking about property? Are we talking about a contract? Are we talking about, different rights that people have, and so on and so forth. So it can get very complicated very quickly. But the fundamental thing that we have to get a handle on is that justice is about the relationships that we have with each other being right, in the sense that everybody receives what is due to them, what is owed to them. So I can give some examples.
Yeah. I was just gonna ask.
Like, so for example, if let's say I'll give you a good example from when I used to teach high school, which I think can illustrate this on many levels. So when you set out a rubric for an assignment, or you give a study guide for a test, there's a certain expectation that in order to get this grade, you have to be able to produce this result on your work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in this situation, what is just is that the person gets the grade that they deserve, because it's in their best interest, for the sake of learning, that they actually have an accurate, sort of representation of where their work is, like how good
Yeah.
are they doing in their schoolwork. And you also have to think about that in relationship to every other student in the class, because if you grade unfairly, right? So you're more lenient with this person, maybe because you show favoritism, you just like the student better, but then you hold to the rubric for all the other students. Now you've created a situation where if people find that out, particularly, now you've disrupted the dynamic of learning in the classroom, and you've created this weird tension where it's like, oh, well, Mr. Tarian has certain favorites, and this person always gets better grades, or, the girls get better grades than the boys, or whatever it is.
So can I interrupt you real quick?
Yeah.
What's the difference then between fairness and justice?
Well, it's those are synonymous terms.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
same thing. So what a person deserves in that situation, what rightfully belongs to them, is an accurate representation of the work that they're doing, and so does everybody else in the class. So that's just. Now, let me just throw mercy in here really quick, but I want to come back to mercy because we have to define it. But if I might, as a teacher, say, okay, well, because I care about the learning that the student, I want to see in the student, I want the student to learn the material, I might give the student another chance to retake the exam, or to amend the mistakes they made on their paper. Okay, so that would be merciful. I'd be giving them some grace there for the sake of being able to learn and get to where they, for their best interest, they should be in their education. So I might do that, but I still have to do that. I still have to adhere to what's fair. So I might, for example, combine the two grades and take the average, the first and the second, to see if I can get them into more of a passing range, But I'm not going to just say, oh, well, you got an A on the second time, so
that would not be mercy.
I'm going to give you the A. Well, it wouldn't be fair, wouldn't be just to the other students, you see, because they're not getting what they deserve. Well, why doesn't everybody get a second chance to get a higher grade? So you can see that I can do both things at the same time. I can be merciful. In other words, they don't deserve that, okay? They don't deserve that. But I give them that grace for the sake of something that I do desire for them, which is that they grow and learn the material, because that's in their best interest and that's for their good.
Yeah.
So again, back to justice. Justice always has to do with understanding how we establish right relationships within the confines of what is yours and what is mine. So in justice, I always give to you what is yours, and you give to me what is mine. When it comes to mercy, right? Or even in we talk about charity, love, because mercy is a subset of love. It's a particular expression of God's love. We give to the other person not what is owed to them or belongs to them rightfully, but what actually belongs to me to give and what belongs to me to be generous with. I can be generous and I can give what is of mine to you for your benefit and for your good.
Yeah.
So that's like sort of the fundamental distinction there.
Can I throw something in here? It seems also somewhere in there, and I don't want to derail this too much from the topic of mercy and justice, but it seems like somewhere in there, there's a judgment that has to be made, right? The word judgment, because I feel like we're afraid to use the word judgment in right now. Like, you hear it all the time, like, oh, you're so judgy. Like, making judgments seems like a bad thing in our society. Like, you can't judge this person, you can't judge this thing, you can't judge this, But it seems like in that process of, what's just and what's merciful, judgment has to happen, right? People have to make judgments about what's right, what might be too much, what might be too little, what might be,
Sure, you have to be discerning and there has to be prudence applied to the situation. But again, it's always the good of the other person and the good of the community as a whole that has to be borne in mind there. And again, we can drill into more specifics on that. But I would say what you're talking about there is, I always like to say God gave us a conscience because we have to make moral evaluations. We have to make judgments about what is good and what is evil. And so we're not to, when Jesus tells us not to judge, the way I like to put it is he's telling us that we are not permitted to hold another person in contempt in our own hearts. We're not allowed to condemn that person in our hearts, to somehow believe that they are beyond mercy or beyond grace, because they should get what they deserve. We all want, it seems, mercy and understanding for ourselves and justice for everyone else because we're hypocrites and we live that contradiction in our lives all the time. So I might deem that what another person is doing is objectively evil, and I might need to name that or state that. But how I handle the person needs to come from a place of humility, from a place of gentleness, especially for us as human beings. I mean, God is God, so we don't. It's sort of like children to parents. You know what I mean? Like, there's a different standard. God has the authority to act in ways that we don't when it comes to one another. So we are not allowed to be in the place of condemning the other person. That is God's domain.
Yeah.
God is just because his judgments are always just, whereas our judgments oftentimes, because they might come out of a place of resentment, they might come out of a place of bitterness, vindictiveness, a desire for vengeance, and oftentimes it'll skew like the punishment we give or the way we treat or handle the person, even if they did something wrong and are deserving of a punishment.
Yeah.
So
I like what you said there, because next time somebody tells me, oh, you're being judgy, I'm going to use your words and say, no, I'm just evaluating. You used to that we have to make moral evaluations.
Well, you do, because
I like that. I'm just evaluating. That's all I'm doing.
But I mean, the point is when a person says you're being judgy, they're being judgy. So it's like, and if you are being judgy, a person might have a right to call you out on that because they might make a judgment that you're looking down condescendingly and arrogantly upon another person's weakness. And who are you to talk? I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like we're always up against that problem. It's like, well, how can I be disgusted with another person for what they've done when I've done plenty of my own bad stuff? So Jesus is, oftentimes, and we've said this, we've talked about this before, when he talks about, don't take, take the log out of your own eye before you take the splinter out of your neighbor's eye. He's talking about the problem of projection, where we tend to be very harsh on other people for the very same sin that we have. And he says, take the log out of your own eye, then you'll know better how to remove the thorn from your neighbor's eye. Well, that implies that you have to make a moral judgment. But how you offer fraternal correction to someone should come from a place of humility, a place where I can identify with your weakness and your fault, but because I'm your brother or I'm your sister or whatever, I need to, maybe call this out and challenge you to a higher standard of integrity. And I'm within my right to do that, but I need to do that in a way that conveys, love and genuine concern for the good of the other person.
Yeah.
But a lot of times we don't. We do it out of a place of, arrogance or contempt or vindictiveness or, like you hurt me, so I want you to hurt and suffer for what you did. Where it's like we're not seeking justice here. We're not seeking to right the wrong. We're just wanting people to pay for the pain they've inflicted.
Yeah.
And that's where God says, vengeance is mine. Because see, God doesn't fall prey to those weak temptations of getting even or whatever. I'm just trying to find like sort of common language to try to describe this.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to take that.
No, but I mean, it's an important point to make that we can't have justice without making moral judgments, and God gives us a conscience to do that. I mean, we couldn't function in society without deciding what is just relationship, and that's why we have laws. And nor would we have a just society if there were no punishments or consequences, no penalties for the transgressions of legitimate laws, because there would be just chaos and disorder.
But I feel like that's kind of where a little bit of a struggle is creeping in. Is, it's almost like this whole notion of what is a correct justice, like what is a real just kind of mentality, and like you said, that has to do with making moral judgments. But I feel like because we're so shying away from this idea of making moral judgments, we are moving in this direction of like confusion about what really is just, because we don't have a measuring rod anymore of like, well, what, we're kind of like acquiescing to sort of whatever somebody wants to think is right, is kind of like.
Well, I know what you're saying. I mean, you're kind of like appealing to a certain argument from relativism. And I have to say, like, I just don't believe relativism is a real thing. I don't believe people are relativists. I think what happens is that we have competing moral standards.
Well, right.
Yeah, so it's like we don't know. Like some people will say, well, that's not a sin, and so we should stop condemning those people for those behaviors, because they don't believe that those behaviors are wrong. But we should punish the people that are actually wanting to punish those people. So, for example, you might say, well, I believe that abortion is right. And women should have the right to an abortion. Right? This is a matter of justice because I have a certain ethical stance on this.
Sure.
And we should actually be punishing the people that are trying to punish women for having abortions because they're the bad people. Well, you still have a moral standard. It's just the question is whether it's right or not,
right,
correct or not, and what's the basis upon which you decide what your moral framework is and what your framework of justice is. And of course, as Christians, we have a particular understanding of the nature and dignity of the human person, and therefore our ethical standard is based upon that understanding, whereas people out in the culture, they have a very different understanding about the nature and dignity of the human person, and therefore they're going to have a different moral standard. So sometimes we have to sort of argue it out, and sometimes we're not on the winning side of that argument because the secular view is so pervasive right now in our culture, and sometimes there's just not a lot we can do about it except we continue to stand up and give witness to what our belief and understanding of justice is. But I don't think it's relativistic. I don't think people actually believe in, hey, you have your truth, I have my truth. Nobody's okay with that arrangement. It's like you have your truth and it's wrong, and I have my truth and it's right, and I'm going to try to get the state to support my view of reality. and I'm going to try to punish you for being in violation of my view of things.
Well, those two
And
things
that's
always
hard.
it's inevitable that they're going to
Yeah.
conflict.
Right. So we have to do a better job of making our case for why our way of seeing things is correct, and our view of justice is the correct view of justice. And that's hard work,
Yeah. Yeah.
But so justice, there's it's what is owed to people, what is due to them based upon what rightfully belongs to them versus me, and that's why we have boundaries, we have borders, we have contractual agreements, we have we have rules that we live by, policies. All of these things are in place in order to maintain some level of just relationships among us, so that we all know how we're supposed to behave, so that our individual rights are respected and the good of the community, can exist in harmony.
Mm-hmm.
And so God is perfectly just in that sense. God only legislates what is in our individual best interest and in our collective communal best interest. So the laws and the rules that he gives are there for our good, our well-being, our flourishing. And when we violate those rules, there is like an innate intrinsic penalty, because sin is its own consequence. When we war against the order of things, that order is always going to win, because in the end we're going to suffer the consequence of those actions,
Mm-hmm.
So you can look around the world today and say there's on the international level, for example, there's a lot of bad players right now on the world stage. So there are wars, and we pay a high price. War is not a good. It's not something, sometimes it's something we have to tolerate in defense of a just cause. But, in the grand scheme of things, war typically resolves very little. It might be a temporary thing, but
Yeah.
in the long term, it breeds resentment.
Yeah.
And so it's complicated, but what I'm trying to get at is that God establishes a just order of things, and when we violate that just order of things, there's a consequence. Now, just like any loving father, there's a certain discipline that God mates out to us, you could say, in order to correct us, in order to, to try to help us to bring our lives more into alignment with the way things should be morally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so we can suffer punishment and penalties as a consequence of our actions. In order to, it's for our sake. That penalty, that punishment is for our sake. And so God is always, God doesn't ever suspend his justice, because the consequence of sinful behavior is always immediate. There's always, we might not perceive it at first, or we might not feel that consequence immediately, but in time we will.
So sometimes those consequences are more external, for instance, it might be something where you do, you end up physically experiencing the result of like a bad decision or a bad choice,
Yeah.
but more often than not, it's an interior sort of like thing that's going on. Is that what you're
Well, it's
suggesting?
both. I mean,
Yeah.
it's both simultaneously. I might pursue what I believe is the good life, which is, money, sex, and power, whatever. And it might be good for a little short while, but pretty soon I'm going to discover how unsustainable that lifestyle becomes, and I'm going to probably ruin my life in the process. My relationships are going to go to pot because, first of all, if I'm rich and wealthy and powerful, who can I trust? So I become paranoid, and who are my friends and who aren't, and and I might spend myself to oblivion, or I might, if I'm a celebrity, I might not be able to handle the public spotlight all the time, and my interior life implodes. I mean, the point is that's not a authentically human life, and
Yeah.
therefore I will end in ruin.
Yeah.
And that's that's God's discipline. So God is always just in that respect. It's like he doesn't throw us over his knee and spank us because he doesn't need to. We might need to do that with our kids because we don't have God's, ability to set up the structures of reality the way
Yeah,
he does.
yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
We don't create the law of gravity, but and so sometimes we have to have kind of punitive type of substitutionary penalties, like a speeding ticket,
Sure.
because the stop signs we create can't make people stop, But when it comes to the laws of nature, that we can't break them. We can't break the laws themselves. We can transgress them and then pay the price for it. And that's and so when it comes to, God is a just God. So this is why, like, if a person spends their whole life, refusing to be in relationship with God, guess what they're going to get when they die? They're going to live their, afterlife separated from God, and we call that hell. And it's pure misery because at that point in time, apparently, there's nothing you can do about it. So that's that consequence is intrinsic to the lifestyle that one has embraced without repentance or without reorienting and turning back to God and bringing oneself back in, or coming back into a right relationship with God. Like if I recognize God as my highest good and my end, I'm going to end up with God in the end. That's how it works.
Right.
And if I choose something else, I'm going to end up with that, which is going to be miserable.
So is this a good time to segue into mercy then?
Sure.
Because this it's the idea, and they brought this up recently as an example in a class that I was in, but the idea that someone can live a life of total separation from God, debauchery, and like just destroying people, leaving them in their wake. So the one example they use, and this is admittedly a pretty extreme example, and I didn't fact check it, but I'm assuming that they were telling the truth, was this Nazi guy. Hess is his last name. And how at the end of his life when he was in prison, did have this conversion to where he... there was a priest that he actually let go in a concentration camp, as the story goes, and for whatever reason. And when he was in prison, he wanted to make a confession, of everything that he had ever done. And this guy was responsible, so they say, for like 3.5 million deaths, directly and indirectly. And so this priest came in that he actually let go. The priest came in and heard his confession, baptized them, basically came into the Catholic Church. And I'm not sure how this guy ended up dying, but I think a lot of people would look at that and be like, it doesn't seem just, It seems like radical mercy that God has to sort of like, this guy has destroyed the lives and generations of future lives, like, kids without parents, blah, 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 all this. And, but all it takes is a conversion in the last moment, a genuine conversion to, like, change all of that. You know what I'm saying?
I do, yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking of a verse in the Old Testament where, the prophet says, if a person is righteous their whole life and then at the end of their life turn away from the just path and they suffer death, versus the person who lives a wretched life their whole life and then turns towards what is just at the end, do they not receive, life for that? And the question is, God says, is it, you say that this is unfair. It's like, is it my ways that are unfair, or is it your ways that are unfair?
Yeah.
And I think that in this situation, if a person turns towards God in a repentant fashion, then he has reoriented his life towards his due end and brought himself back into a, by the grace of God, of course, back into a right relationship with God. And therefore, he will attain the end to which he has aimed himself. Now, whether there's reparation to be made for the whole life that he's lived up to that point, that's why we believe in purgatory. And therefore, whatever injustice is not satisfied, you could say, in terms of the complete transformation of the inner life of this man, will remain. But think about what Jesus said to the thief on his one side there from the cross. This day you will be with me in paradise. This is the same man who said, we deserve to be up here crucified. So, and Jesus tells the parable of the workers, that come at different times of the day, and the person at the end of the day gets the same wage. And he says, well, who are you to say that it's wrong of me to be generous with what I have to give? In fact, it's God's right to be as generous as he wants. It's just for him to give what because everything is his, and everything that we have is his to give, and we've received it as a gift from him.
Yeah.
See, we're not in that same position,
right?
Because we don't have that kind of super abundant generosity. We're not the source of all things. God is. So, who am I to question God's generosity? Now, let's just talk about mercy, though, because I think we have to back into the question a little bit more. But mercy, when we think about mercy, again, mercy is a particular expression of love. And in love, the difference between charity and justice is in charity, I give what is mine to give. It's not about what is owed to you. It's not the logic of the relationship. In justice, the logic of the relationship, to be in right relationship with you, I owe you what belongs to you, and you owe me what belongs to me. In charity, I don't. It's not a matter of owing an obligation. It's this is mine, and it's my right, you could say, to give to you whatever I want to give out of generosity, not because you're deserving of it, but just because I desire to bless you with my goodness. So mercy, so that's love. Now, mercy is a particular expression of love and generosity, where God has a special love for that which is most fragile and vulnerable within us. Okay, so divine mercy, it's like, think of a parent who looks upon a little child, a little toddler, say, who is very, very fragile, very vulnerable, very unable to protect and guard themselves. When they get hurt, and you have this outpouring of, compassion and tenderness towards the child, that's an example of mercy that we do it, we don't even think about it. It's almost an innate response. We just feel a particular tender type of love towards what is fragile and the injury and the wound of another person. It's not that the calculus here is not about what is owed or deserved. It's what the person needs, right? It's about it's about how love desires to affirm, what is good in the other. And there's something about the reality of our created existence that, as human beings particularly, we're extremely vulnerable creatures. We're very fragile. So God has a particular love for us on account of how fragile and vulnerable we are. There's a tenderness. This is the language of the Old Testament, that God has a certain tenderness towards us. He's gentle, and he's kind, and he's patient, and he's slow to anger, because he knows how weak we are. That weakness is not our fault. It's a weakness that's there by a kind of design, because when God created us as material beings, it's just the nature of our existence that we're just very vulnerable and very fragile.
Yeah.
In a way that the angels, for example, are not. So God loves us in this very particular way with tremendous compassion and tenderness, because it's it's um it's how he loves us in our kind of native state.
Okay.
Okay, we're weak. So part of that weakness
Yeah.
is we're also capable of sinning
Yeah.
and getting ourselves in way over our heads into a lot of trouble,
Yeah.
right? So we also, therefore, God also expresses mercy towards us by forgiving us for the wrongs we do, because quite frankly, we can't help ourselves.
Mhm.
Like we want to believe that we're more capable and more self-sufficient than we in fact are on our
Yeah.
own, but we routinely do the wrong thing
Yeah.
because we're very weak and vulnerable creatures. And so God gives his forgiveness to us. He gives us many chances to learn our lessons and to continue to grow
Yes.
and to mature. So,
Can I jump in
yeah,
here?
yeah.
So my question is, and I think this is probably because, like a lot of people, I probably like to have things very neatly and tidily organized. So it's like I just want to make sure I'm correct in thinking this. God's mercy can sometimes be perceived as unfair, right? Because some people have are prone to like a greater weakness, for whatever reasons, you know what I mean? And so God will show mercy. Let's go back to the classroom example you were talking about with the test taking and all that. Like, let's say as the teacher, you know that there's a student in your class that has a learning disability where taking a regular test like everybody else is a real difficulty for them. So you giving them a grade that is not reflective necessarily of the outcome of their work, but rather your your knowing of their attempt or their effort, their genuine effort to it, and then somebody's like, well, wait a minute, like my papers I only missed this many, and you gave me a B, but you also gave this person a B. Is that what you're talking about? Like, in other words, it's not so neat and clean and tidy all the time in terms of how it's dished out or how it's given out. Like, God's mercy can be perceived as like unfair.
Well, I think you just said it perfectly. It can be perceived as unfair. The question is it unfair in the grand scheme of things? For example, you could turn right around and say, well, how many times has God accommodated himself to you?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So who am I to judge then? Who am I to tell God, to judge that God is being unfair in this situation? That might be my perception, but that's not. If God is being merciful in this way, it's not unfair. We might perceive it that way. Now,
Yeah.
as on a human level, I might accommodate myself, to use your example. I might accommodate myself to a student with a special needs in a way that is unfair. In other words, I can't take anything away from what that student without the disability deserves. So if they deserve an A, they get an A. I can't have different. Like, I can't give the person with the disability an A when they don't do A work, and give the person who's smarter and more capable a B because I think they're capable of more. That's not fair, and that's why you have a rubric that against which, like, the A is here, the B is here, the C is here. But what I can do is I might be able to make an accommodation where it's like, okay, everyone else has to take this test together in the classroom, but because you have test-taking anxiety, I'm going to let you go to the counselor's office and be in the quiet and the privacy of your own room, or maybe you have ADHD and people tapping, or whatever.
Yeah.
So I can give you the best shot at showing me what you actually know and what you learn here.
Yeah.
So there's both a kind of justice in that, but there's also an accommodation, which is an expression of love. It's like, because what I will for you is your good. And the good that I will for you is that you learn as much as you're capable of learning.
Yeah.
And so I might make an accommodation to help you get as far down that road as you're capable of getting. Whereas if I didn't make that accommodation, you might end up way back here, and that's not in your best interest. So I'm going to try to, but most likely you're never going to get the same outcome that
Yeah.
the other more gifted student has, and therefore the gifted student shouldn't be penalized. Like, I mean, the highest grade you can give is an A. Like,
Yeah.
I can't give you higher than an A, but if you get the A, you get the A.
Yeah.
You know, but I'm not going to, I, as a teacher, would never say, oh, well, you did C work, but because you have a disability, I'm going to give you an A and I'm going to give you an A, because that wouldn't be just.
Yeah.
You're not, again, justice is always about what
Yeah.
a person deserves. And the accommodation in this case is what I have the authority to give
Yeah.
as the teacher. So I can try to create the conditions to optimize your ability to attain the highest performance you can in that. And that I might not owe you that,
Mm-hmm.
okay? But because I genuinely love and care for your well-being in the grand scheme of things, I'm going to make that accommodation. So God, you know, you might deserve an immediate punishment if you commit this horrible sin, but because I love you and I know your weakness and I care for you and I want you to attain your perfection and
Yeah.
union with me, I'm going to give you, you know,
Yeah.
humans, I'm going to give you lots of chances.
Right.
And I'm going to send you the prophets, and I'm going to give you my word of God, and I'm going to give you my sacraments and all the graces you need, because I'm a merciful God, because I want to give you, you know, you don't deserve this by right. It doesn't belong to you.
Yeah.
I don't owe this to you, but because I love you, I'm going to accommodate myself to you to give you the best possible chance of being able to be mended and healed and restored to the life that I
Yeah.
have in mind for you.
Yeah.
Now, the choice ultimately is up to us. We have to decide, you know. But well, anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah,
Does
I
that,
was just
does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And some of the thoughts I have are, one, it makes me think of the whole prodigal son story,
Mhm.
in that the brother who kind of had everything also had a perception problem of what was, you know, like the reaction that his dad had to the brother that seemed, you know, not seemed, but squandered everything. And I feel like that is, you know, like generally speaking, that's us. Like we do have a perception problem, and we have a need. I feel like we have this innate need to try to figure out, or to see everybody's lives as like easy to figure out. You know, in other words, if we're being honest, and this is just sort of my own maturation, I think, as a disciple, is like having a lot of grace and patience for the complexities of people's individual lives.
Yes.
Like a lot of times it seems on the surface, oh, this is what it is, and, you know, there's no way this person deserves this. But the reality is, oftentimes, there's a lot going on
Right.
that
And
we don't know, and we have to. So from a perspective of God's mercy and God's justice, we just have to get into the habit of trusting God, like trusting that God knows best, even if it doesn't make any sense to us. The difficulty comes into earth, like, okay, what do we, like, how do I show, okay, if I'm trusting that God is merciful with that person, how do I practice it as best as I can? I feel like that's, for me, as I keep growing and trusting God more, I am willing to kind of like leave those things to God. I think the hard part is just how I do it, how I live that. You know, how do I show mercy? How do I, you know, have an understanding of justice for people? I think that's, for me, that's the hard part.
yeah, it is hard. I think that first of all, we need to understand God's mercy and God's justice properly.
Yeah.
And then we have to seek to emulate that to the best of our ability. And so, to use the example of parenting, for example, there's times in which, like, there's the order of justice within the household, and people have to get what they deserve, in order to grow and mature. Again, it always has to be, I think what we have to extract from our hearts and we have to purify ourselves of is that heated sense of self-righteous indignation. Like when we get our asses up in the air over what other people's faults and failings.
Yeah.
And we're really just looking down at people. We're there's arrogance and there's vindictiveness, and we want them to get what they deserve and what they paid for because they hurt me, or they're inconveniencing me, or they're creating a mess that I have to clean up, or whatever. Mm-hmm. And the Lord, Jesus does not have that problem. God does not have that problem. We do, because we're sinners. And so we have to purify ourselves of those impure, imperfect motives. So, when I discipline my children, I don't do that so much anymore because they're all young adults now, but there's other things we have to deal with along those same lines, like what's just, but when they were little and I was raising them, I can't let them, quote unquote, get away with stuff, because then I'm not doing them any good. I'm actually compounding the problem of their own sinfulness. They need to be disciplined. So in the order of justice, but how I do that, when I do the way, I oftentimes tell this story about when I was a little tyke, and I did something and got in trouble. I was sent to my room, so I got time out. That was my dad's justice. But my dad would always come down halfway through, and he would open up the door, and I was usually curled up on the floor right by the door. This is when I was like 5 or 6. And my dad would always peek his head in, and he would look at me with a smile on his face, and he would wink at me. And that was his way of saying it's good between us. Like, I love you, and this doesn't change our relationship at all. Mm-hmm. But what you did was wrong, right? There's a tenderness and a kindness and an accommodation to my weakness. There's a difference, for example, with a child. I've had children who, at the slightest awareness of having done something wrong, they fall apart. They start crying. Yeah. They know that what they did was wrong. They feel terrible about it. I don't need to punish them because they're punishing themselves. Right. They've come into the right frame of mind with this. They know what they did is wrong. They don't want to do this again. They're going to amend their ways and move forward. I have other kids who, no matter what you say to them, they just cannot see the error of their ways. They're as blind as a bat. And sometimes I have to use more severe discipline in order to help them learn their lesson, in the hope that hopefully they'll come to see with their own eyes. But there's also, when you see that, you see when your children, they start kind of like, they're kind of starting to self-correct a little bit. Mm-hmm. You can show them grace and you can show them mercy. Maybe they falter, again. Yeah. They're making the effort to go the right way, but they still falter, but you don't come down on them that time. You just let it go, because they're in a process, right, of growing and changing and redirecting themselves. That takes discernment. Yeah. But the discernment is, what is in the best interest of my child? There's times in which I've got to be pretty exacting in the justice part and in the disciplining of it. And there's other times in which I have to be merciful and gracious in accommodating their weakness, because it's part of the process that's going to lead them to the outcome that we're all hoping for, which is their maturation and their growth and their. Yeah. So we have to see God the Father in that same way, that He's perfectly discerning of us individually and collectively. If there's a community or population of people that need to go into exile, they're going to go into exile. But then they were restored to the land, right? And not only that, but a foreign power rebuilt their temple for them. They didn't deserve that. That was mercy. That was grace. That was God showing the total spectrum of His right and loving relationship with us. And this is what a loving father does. The letter to the Hebrews talks about this beautifully. In chapter 12, I'd ask everybody listening to go read Hebrews chapter 12. It's all about the discipline of the Father, and that discipline comes because he loves us. But the entire celebration of the Paschal mystery, Jesus did not deserve that. We didn't deserve the salvation that came from it. It's not owed to us by right because we don't possess it as our own. It's a gift. And that gift God gave to us as an act, an expression of his merciful heart. Why? Because he seeks nothing but our own good. And he's going to do everything that he possibly can in his power to win us back to himself. And so sometimes he corrects us and disciplines us to get our attention. And sometimes he's incredibly, what appears to be lenient. But when you say, well, wait a second, that's not fair. It's like, well, it is fair because he lets the sun rise on the good and the bad alike. He allows the wheat and the wheat to grow together. These are all things that Jesus tells us about the Father's justice and the Father's mercy. And both of those things are attributes of our Father. He's both things, and they don't contradict each other, but they attend to different dimensions of our relationship with him.
Yeah.
And they should show up in our relationships with each other.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
No, it does make sense. Of course, like at the end of every conversation we ever have, I'm like, well, I got to spend this week kind of breaking this down for my, it's all good. It's a struggle. It's a struggle that I have. I would love to think that, that I have a really great understanding of all this, but I know that it's constantly evolving, and that my sense of justice and my sense of mercy have to keep going deeper. And it's great. Like every time we have these kinds of things where I take one step closer, it's a great experience. Honestly, I just think it's because I feel like my heart is becoming more like God's heart. So everything you said, it's fantastic, and so I'm.
Well, if it's okay, just very quickly, I just want to say one last thing, and then we'll wrap. But
it's not okay.
It's just going too long.
No, go ahead.
No, I just like the one thing I'm not saying, and I don't think our tradition says, is that God is permissive. He's not permissive of sin. So, for example, in the Old Testament, or even when Christ calls us to repent, or when he says, turn back to me in the Old Testament, turn back to me, return to me, right? There's an implication of sin in that statement. But God is showing patience. He's giving us time and space to amend our ways. That's mercy. But the justice is implied in the fact is that your ways are faulty, and I'm calling you out on that. I'm not saying, oh, well, it's fine. I know you're weak and you can't help yourself. So it's okay if you worship false gods.
Right.
And it's the same thing today. If someone's living a lifestyle, we might challenge them and say, God has more for you. God desires a better life and a different life. And we can challenge people without saying, you're a wretched sinner and I don't ever want to have anything to do with you again because I can't associate with people that live this way. That's the implication of such a statement. Return to me, or come, turn back to me, amend your ways. The implication is that there's something wrong here. God's calling it out, but he's giving us time and space because he's merciful and good to get it sorted out with his help. We can't do it on our own, but with his help. So I just think part of that discernment is that to know when we're crossing the line and being permissive. And we're being permissive whenever we refuse to call sin. Oh, that's okay. I know that the church says that fornication is wrong, but it's fine. As long as you're good with it, it's fine for you. And there's a lot of that going on in our culture today. And that's not mercy. That's misplaced mercy, and that's not just because it actually isn't in the best interest of the individual. You're actually aiding and abating their sin by telling them that what you're doing right now is perfectly fine.
Mm.
And I think that we are never permitted to do that. We can say, this is not okay, but I understand that this is a struggle. This is a difficulty for you. I'll walk with you along this journey, but I'm going to accommodate your weakness. I'm not going to accommodate sin itself. I'm not going to say sin is not sin.
That's a great point to make, because I think that's it, in the heart of people's, even mine, in the heart of the struggle between, like, where that line is between mercy and justice, is that, like, how far does my mercy go to where it is it becoming an act of permissiveness of somebody's sin, or or is the way that I'm reacting, like, going back to the idea of parenting, am I seeking a justice that makes that person, like, forces them to hurt, like, versus a more like, instructive, or you know what I mean? These are all, I'm not doing a great job of communicating what's the million things that are going on in my head, but that's a great point. Let me just go back to that. It's a great point to make, that these things, sometimes if they get a little bit too awry, can either go to, like, hyper, shaming, like the whole justice thing can be all about shaming if it gets out of control, and the mercy thing can lead to a permissiveness that also is not very good for us or for the person that we're. So
yeah, you're in the permissiveness, you're calling good evil and evil good, and that's not merciful, and it's not just.
Yeah.
So is this really in the best interest of the individual? Are we really seeking their greatest good in that? And that's how we have to think about it. But
it's great.
Yes, that's well said.
Cool.
All right. Well, so justice and mercy, as we think about, or I should say, as we celebrate this feast of God's mercy, hopefully this conversation has helped bring some clarity to you in terms of, the difference and distinction between God's justice and his mercy, how these two things can happen simultaneously within God's own heart, and should within our own hearts. And each has its own way of determining and defining how we relate to people, especially when they're in places of weakness and sinfulness. So happy Easter to all of you, and be sure to like this video and share it with your friends, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.
The Wise Guys Podcast is a production of Preambula Group, a Catholic ministry dedicated to helping you thrive in the heart of Jesus. Visit us on the web at preambula.org and follow us on social media.